Hi, we're going to start right now. We have more people coming, and as you can see, it's filling up outside. I'm sorry that you probably can't see very well, but anyway, it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you here today. My name is Jane Debevoise, and I'm the chair of Asia Art Archive. We have a main office, which is actually in Hong Kong. It's a library and archive, public space open to the public, free of charge in Hong Kong for research and programs such as this. But we have this very small space, you can see it's a very small space, that we fill to the brim for events primarily. But we also have a reading room, a library, and we do have research people, students and scholars come in on a regular basis to look at our materials here. Our focus is contemporary art of and from Asia. Now tonight, we're delighted to have three major figures in the field of Asian American art collectives. But first I'm going to say a little bit about the biographies, just a tiny little bit. You probably know all of these people very well. And then I'm going to go over the schedule of events, the sale of our program, the rundown of our program, because we have a lot to cover in a very short period of time. First of all, I'm delighted to say that Dr. Margo Machida is here, Professor Emeritus of Art History and Asian American Studies at the University of Connecticut. She's a scholar, an independent curator, and an activist cultural critic, specializing in Asian American art and visual culture. I am sorry to say that I have not read your book, but I love the title, and I definitely will go out and get it. And if we don't have it in this library, it's going to be here ASAP. Unsettled Visions, Contemporary Asian American Artists, and the Social Imaginary. Next, we have Bing Lee, who's a visual artist based in New York, whose work has been exhibited widely at both in museums, art festivals, galleries, here domestically and internationally. He established a studio, the Bing Lee Studio, in 1990, and has been commissioned to design site-specific public art projects, one of which you can see when you travel on the street?
No, NQ.
But is it on all the lines going through Canal Street? NQ, well, NQ, I've seen it many, many times. Canal Street subway station, so please stop and admire. He's the recipient of many awards, but for the purposes of tonight's event, it is important to emphasize that you're a founding member of many Asian art collectives. Tomato Grey, Godzilla Asian American Art Network, Epoxy Art Group, and the Visual Art Society in Hong Kong. Tonight's moderator and introducer will be Ryan Lee Wong, who's a writer, cultural organizer based here in Brooklyn. He's a managing director of Kundiman, am I saying that correctly? And a visiting scholar at the APA Institute at NYU. Tonight's events, what we will do is, Ryan, I'm going to hand this over to Ryan to introduce and give an overview on the program. He's got 5 minutes. Margo has 10 minutes, okay? 10 minutes. And Bing, I've understood that you are very generous with your conversation, and so you have 10 minutes too. And I am going to be very, very strict, okay? So I will cut everybody off if you're going on too long. Because really, I'm saying this because we really want this to be a conversation. We want to have at least 25 minutes, if not more, for question and answer. And for any of you who've been here before, you know that I mean it when I say that if you're not going to ask a question, I will ask you to ask a question. I will. And I do this, okay? So pay attention. And I look forward to this event. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you three for doing this. It's great. Thank you.
So thank you all for coming out. As you might have heard, we had way more interest in this event than capacity, so I'm very happy you're all here in this room with us. We'll do it again in another version another time. As you might know, we had a Godzilla reunion a couple months ago. That was a lot of fun. And so thank you so much, Jane, Ali, Hillary, Asia Art Archive for hosting us. Asia Art Archive is really one of the great resources for anyone interested in contemporary Asian art and how Asian art is talked about and studied in the diaspora. So I just want to take a moment to kind of frame why we're having this question. And I think when Margo and I were talking about pulling this program together, the central question was really why now? Why is there both this interest in this history of Asian American arts collectives in this particular moment? And why is there also, in this particular moment, a resurgence in Asian American arts collectives being formed? So Margo, we're really lucky to have really one of the architects of Asian American art history, Margo Machida here, who's going to set up the history and the framework, starting with the 1970s and talking about the transnational turn. Bing Lee, who is part of many, many arts collectives, will talk especially about Epoxy and Tomato Grey this evening. And then I will try to bring us up a little bit to the present moment. In addition to our panelists, I just wanted to welcome a lot of the other members of these arts collectives who are here tonight. So from Godzilla, we have Eugenie Tsai, Zhang Hong Tu, Sung Ho Choi. From Basement and Godzilla, we have Arlen Huang, Nina Kuo, and Lauren Roser. Am I missing anyone? Thank you all for being here. I also want to, so this will be a very lively conversation. I really invite everyone who's part of these collectives to take part. And I also want to extend an invitation, especially to the younger folks in the audience. We're really curious why you're curious about this, so please ask questions. I really hope this is an interesting intergenerational dialogue tonight. So please join me in welcoming Margo Machida.
Anyways, I want to thank the Asian Art Archive in America, Jean Debevoise, for inviting me to talk today. I'm primarily going to draw on examples from my experience in New York, but I'm examining how frameworks of thinking about identity politics, and arts activism shifted between the 60s and 90s. I know you have 10 minutes. And how the convergence of domestic activism, accelerating migration, and transnational circulation have shaped the emergent artistic, political, and curatorial practices. The 1970s and 80s are really, as everybody here knows, a watershed in Asian American history. A surging Asian migration dramatically reconfigured the demographics of Asian America. Following the 1965 abolition of restricted federal immigration quotas, the U.S. Asian population quadrupled by 1990. As foreign-born Asians became the majority population, their growing presence inevitably brought forward a continuum of experiences, priorities, and agendas that transformed the social, political, and intellectual landscape of Asian America. Now, the following remarks are going to really quickly trace some of the context in which art by Asians in America was exhibited, debated, and written about during this period. Now, the term Asian American art, like Asian American, first comes into general usage in the late 60s. It is very closely associated with the rise of the Asian American movement and academic ethnic studies, which galvanized that generation of art activists to use art to promote social change. Activism encompassed a really wide range of critical and expressive interventions that proceeded in different realms of civic engagement and collective action simultaneously. In political protest movements, in community arts groups, in artist collectives, in the academy, and in the art world. Fueled by broad-based protest, identity, anti-war, and counterculture movements, this politically inspired cultural production confronted a turbulent domestic history that was marked by racism, by discrimination, by exclusion and economic exploitation of Asians, and probed how Asian Americans are represented, positioned, and understood in this nation. The 70s also witnessed, this is the interesting thing with this term, witnessed the nationwide formation of grassroots organizations that played a foundational role in Asian American in the arts movement. To create a base for those efforts, pioneering organizations with a strong visual arts component were established in major metropolitan hubs, such as Basement Workshop and Asian American Art Center in New York, and Kearny Street Workshop and Japantown Art and Media Workshop in San Francisco. Just some examples. Activist artists typically produced large-scale public murals. And I bet you people recognize these. silk screen posters, prints, and illustrations intended to impart clear social messages that could be apprehended by the broadest possible audience. Social documentary photography also played an integral role as a visual record of that transformative period, bearing witness to unfolding events, illuminating details of community life, and chronicling important figures. Yet, by the 1980s, identity politics and multiculturalism increasingly came to be viewed as confining and problematic, pigeonholing art and artists within domestic paradigms shaped by historically inequitable U.S. race, ethnic relations, and minority politics. And moreover, amid burgeoning post-65 migration, recent arrivals often had little knowledge of the historic struggles of Asians in this nation. Rather, they brought their own distinctive transnational perspectives to bear in negotiating their presence in American society. And indeed, the rise of the community arts organizations actually converged with this tectonic shift that was well underway by the late 70s. When I first became involved with these New York, Chinatown-based groups, this period witnessed, President Nixon's historic 1972 visit to mainland China, South Vietnam's collapse in 1975. Events like this led to a major influx of Chinese and Southeast Asians. By the 80s, New York and Chinatown became a major magnet for artists in Beijing and Shanghai, alongside Hong Kong and Taiwan. Local Asian American arts groups and alternative spaces like Kwok Gallery, which you see here, become meeting grounds where Asian Americans and Chinese immigrant artists, among them the dissident artist Ai Weiwei, mingled and responded to unfolding global events. Now, art emerging from this transnational nexus, even when addressing themes of cross-cultural identity, decentered the U.S. and domestic identity politics as a primary point of focus. An example here is the China, June 4th, 1989, that was organized by the Asian American Arts Center shortly after the violent crackdown in Tiananmen Square. And Zhang implied critique of the Communist Chinese regime's repressive actions via the images of the omnipresent Mao Zedong is a striking element in that exhibition. Now, my first published art writing actually was for the Epoxy Art Group's 1985 show Myths at Basement Workshop. That showcased this heterogeneous group of New York-based Chinese immigrant artists, which Bing Lee is going to be talking about. But this essay presaged my involvement, this really sustained engagement with foreign-born Asian artists in the U.S. His work is inspired by experiences of circulating and forming attachments among cultures. That ongoing interest subsequently led me to organize the exhibition Asia America. This is 1994, Identities in Contemporary Asian American Art for the Asia Society Galleries. These are all familiar images, I'm sure. This also during the 90s, rhetorics of globalization and the concept of diaspora, connoting transnational movement and fluidity, gained increasing currency in projects that brought Asian American, Asian emigre, and Asian artists together. And among them was Across the Pacific Contemporary Korean and Korean American Art, mounted in 1993 by Queen's Museum. Significantly, the project's impetus came from three foreign-born Korean artists who founded the group Soro Korean Cultural Network. And one member of the late Mo Bak paved the way for the 1988 show Minjung Art. It was an artist space and introduced this new political art to South Korea. Now, there are also more recent critical and curatorial efforts, like the 2012 Taiping Jiangguo exhibition, which also served to complicate and to challenge existing understandings of this transformative period. And revising key moments of the 80s and 90s in New York. The show calls forth the informal social groups and the underground support networks that existed outside the mainstream American art world. And this is, you can see a map of the Lower East Side, in which domestic and foreign-born figures like Martin Wong, Ai Weiwei, Titusha, and Kwok all crossed paths. All right, the transnational turn of the 90s likewise spurred the formation of Godzilla Asian American Art Network. As a loosely structured pan-Asian, multi-generational, and cross-disciplinary network of artists, curators, and writers, Godzilla embodies the changing traditions of the Asian communities at the time. Co-founded in 1990 by Bing Lee, Ken Chu, and myself, our first meeting took place actually nearby here in Brooklyn. We recognized that the influx from Asia and global Asian diasporas demanded a new type of platform where the American-born and the newly arrived could actively engage one another. Whereas most of the early members had prior involvement with Asian American community arts groups, many others ultimately did not necessarily share that history. And even as we came together around common interests based on being Asian in America, the group's orientation was never specifically identitarian, and no single group standpoint or ideology prevailed. Now, despite deliberately departing from existing community models, Godzilla chose not to institutionalize or to be based in an ethnic enclave, but rather to remain untethered, roving freely among artist lofts and alternative spaces throughout the city. And early on, Godzilla's open slideshows and the forums routinely attracted between 80 and 100 artists. The group gained notoriety for taking on the Whitney Museum for its historic lack of inclusion of Asian American artists in the Whitney Biennials. And although it disbanded in 2001, Godzilla continues to capture the interest of new generations of artists, as Ryan Wong is going to relate. So in closing, I'd like to posit Asianness in America as an evolving constellation of positions, relationships, and practices in which culture producers negotiate the contemporary world and their presence as social actors within it. This historic impetus is to create multiple platforms, lines of expression, investigation, and critique. It's, in my mind, aptly summarized by the late curator Karen Higa's observation that Godzilla's organizers, quote, understood that power within the field of culture is aligned along axes of privilege, where making art is only one part of the equation. Thank you.
Epoxy, and this is one project that we didn't show the face. That is 36 tactics. Let's show. And for the epoxy, I tried to make it short and brief. It's a long story. First, there's a 3 Hong Kong artists. We're all from Ohio. Graduate from Ohio, Columbus College, Art and Design. And we moved to New York one by one. And so the 3 artists are Ming Fei, Jerry Kwan, and Ben Lee. So Ming Fei is a sculptor, Jerry Kwan is a painter, and I'm a drawer. I draw my diary at that time. Well, anyway, that's 1979. We share a loft in Soho. We work and live there under one roof. So after a while, at one point, we're thinking maybe it's not a bad idea to work collectively on projects. So we work on something that's different from what we have been doing in our own studio. And then we talk about that. And Hawk moved from Hong Kong to New York. And we share the same loft. Before he moved to, he found the gallery, Cork Gallery, on Mott Street at that time. And that is how Epoxy started. And the first show, which is works on wall, is at Cork's Gallery. And that is the next one. And that's a whole picture. And that's the first show of epoxy at the Cork Gallery. And it's also the first exhibition of Cork Gallery too. And we have two new members, Ken Chong and Eric Chan. They both are painter. And we decided to just paint on the wall and paste up on the wall and just go work on the wall. And we print a catalog with a shoestring budget. So we Xerox it and just staple it. And that's the first catalog of epoxy. I still have one copy. And then, let me see, the next one. This is a main face sculpture. And you can see it's very different, from the Western wall. And everybody is very different. And this is Jerry Kwan's painting. And this is a Hawkesbury work. But I think it's the 80s when he moved to New York. And this is my drawing in my diary. And this is a Wood to Reality. That show we invited to have a window installation. We decided to make a portrait of we have 5 artists. We want to make a portrait of that, but instead of making a portrait of the body and the picture, we just have a chalk mark of our body. And instead of just drawing the face and all that, we write something and to kind of depict what the perspective of being an immigrant, and just to put it up on the window. So that is one of the early work of epoxy. And this is we collaborate with Alan Daughtry, aka Red Spot Outdoor Slide Theater. And what we did is we used a drawing and Xerox on an XJ and on a 120 format. And Alan have a projector and just project on the building, the corner building on Spring and Broadway. And I have to mention about here, 2 persons is not from Hong Kong. And one is Andrew Carver, Culver. And some of the document, they misspelled it as Carver, but it's a Carver, it's Culver. And he's a sound artist those days from Canada. And he participated the first show and the last show, and many shows in between. So he's more active than most of the epoxy members. And some of the document doesn't have his name on it. So I have to clarify here. And a lot of people have a wrong impression that epoxy is a Hong Kong artist based in New York. Actually, it's not true. And Andrew Carver is from Canada, and Hong Tu is from China, and Alan Daughtry is from Texas. And they both were very active and involved in the epoxy projects. So this is the poster we made, and also it's an invitation card, but also Xerox. And we did all the Xerox on Mott Street, Todd. Everybody know Todd? Yeah, that's okay. And this is another outdoor slide show that we collaborated with Alan. And this one, we did not do the work, we curated the work. And we we invite artists to send us some drawings, and we make a slide for them. And Redspot sponsored the show, and you can tell the paper is from material for the arts. So and okay, this one show is our context in Hong Kong, and this is the only show. None of the Epoxy members have ever seen the show because we just mail the work, which is a Xerox again, we use that again, and the slide, and we just mail to the organizer in Hong Kong, and through snail mail. Yeah, and that's the only show that none of the members saw.
Where did it take place?
I forgot that's the one. It's a pop-up. I forget it's a,
they do the,
yeah, it's in a it's a pop-up exhibition in an old building, but I don't recall exactly what the address is. And this is the 36 tactics, and this one Hong Tu joined in, and we spent a lot of time in doing research, and a lot of time to do production too. So the first show is at Sabina Fong's gallery, which is a small format. We just use a legal size and cut it out. And then after that, Alternate Museum liked to invite us to have a show there. So we make a second one, which is a large format, but we don't have the money to funding to do that. So we paste up 4 equal size together and coated with epoxy. That's how we make it. And so that's 36 tactics.
You have 1 minute.
I have 1 minute. So this is this one of the piece. Okay, this is the last show. This is a 18 level of HAL. This is the last show at Asian American Art Center. And after this show, we have another show proposed, but most of the artists did not agree to have another show. And so that's the project fell through. And this is the Epoxy Logo. And epoxy, you know, that is resin adhesive, and mixed with the AP glue, you know, with the hardener, and then there's a chemical reaction, release a lot of energy and heat. So that applied to the epoxy art group as a collective. So when we work together, you know, there's a lot of energy among the artists, and also a lot of heat too. So that is the nature of the artist collective, and also I think it's the beauty of it. And then after all the epoxy, most of the epoxy members left, 2 of them remained. The 2 die-hard epoxy members, which who's Ming Fei and Paul, and they decided to carry on and change the logo. And have a couple more shows. And so maybe this is Epoxy 2.0. Okay, just briefly about the Tomato Grey. Now, fast forward to present time. This is Tomato Grey. Tomato Grey is a group of, this one is really 6 Hong Kong artists based in New York. And this is the first show at the White Box. But I have to mention about this, Tomato Grey is so different from epoxy. In one way, is epoxy we did not apply for any grant. And this Tomato Grey, we have to have the grant first. So we have the grant from Hong Kong Art Development Council and RMCC and all that. And once we got the funding, we have the show. and which is different from epoxy. Epoxy, the last show, we got the funding and nobody want to go on. So, and then it's a go through fast. And this is this is all the first show at White Box, all the first 6 founding members. And that's the opening at White Box. And this is the second show at EC Foundation. And there's the opening there. And this is Samson Young's work. And this is a picture of the whole tomato gray members with a new member, Ryan Lee Wong. And this reminds me like Tuesday lunch club. We always talk about food and art, in front of a dining table. So, and the tomato gray, the name is like it's a funny name. Yeah, it's a very funny name for artist collective. But a lot of people will ask, like a tomato was tomato. Tomato is like maybe can categorize as a fruit or vegetables. But when you eat a tomato, who would ask that? And to me, talking about art and food, and yeah, I'd like to say, if the tomato tastes good, it's a good tomato. Thank you.
What I'm really offering here is just some notes on my perspective, really answering this fundamental question of why, after endless debates about what Asian American identity means, if anything, why after identity politics has been debated and thrown out and returned, people continue to choose to collectivize, to join together in these kinds of collectives. So here are just some notes, and I think part of what I'll suggest is that the reason people do this has to do with the political circumstances, the conditions of cultural production at each generation that comes into these collectives. So as Margo pointed out, Basement Workshop was really part of the formation of Asian American identity itself. It began in the late 1960s, just as Asian American identity was coming together. They actually met in a basement. And unlike a lot of understandings of a lot of art collectives today, they weren't really concerned, I think, with museums or gallery representation as very much art for the people. And of course, the politics of the day were third world liberation. You had the Black Panthers, you had the Young Lords in New York City, a lot of Asian American radical groups in the streets of Chinatown. And I think Basement Workshop had a very DIY, do-it-yourself kind of ethos, where people were just learning how to make art. And really, I would argue this is the first time Asian Americans collectively owned and produced their own visual culture, which is pretty remarkable. I should also mention Basement wasn't just visual arts. There was a magazine, Bridge Magazine, that was published quarterly. There was a resource center that gathered together materials of Asian American arts. But I think it's so kind of fundamental to a lot of these collectives. Bob Lee's Asian American Art Center came out of Basement Workshop. The Museum of Chinese America came out of Basement Workshop. And then as Margo really sharply pointed out, there was this turn in the 1980s where you had groups like Epoxy. And I think a lot of the new generations of Chinese American might have a slightly different understanding of Asian American identity, or even their own Chineseness that wasn't necessarily Asian American than the generation before. And I think that's really interesting. But what's great about Epoxy, I think, is the way that they collaborated on these big installations, these kind of frenetic, fun things that really would take over a space and leave their imprint. And then I think Godzilla represents something a little bit different in that a lot of the artists there were producing for walls, were producing for showings in museums and galleries, and I think for the first time had an interest and desire to, and political urgency behind getting Asian American artists presented in museums as Asian American artists. And I think this is a new turn. I'm totally open to members of Godzilla disagreeing or correcting me on this. And as Margo pointed out, I think one of the most famous acts was to write this open letter to the director of the Whitney Museum, who then invited members of Godzilla in for a slideshow. So Godzilla would do these slide slams, right, every now and then. And for those of you who have never done a slide slam, that's when artists had to photograph their slides and you had to show it to each other on the slide carousel. And that's how work got up, right? This is right? So the directors of Whitney said, okay, come in, show me some slides. And in the 93 biennial, one of Godzilla's members, Byron Kim, was included in the exhibition, this kind of iconic piece. A few years later, Eugenie curated an exhibition of Lynn Yamamoto and Tamiya Arai, two Godzilla members at the upstate Whitney campus. So it worked. I think Godzilla really lit a fire under the art world to have this needed conversation about representation in mainstream arts institutions. Okay, so I think it's important to note that in the 90s you had the formation of Saucy, the South Asian Women's Creative Collective. And I think what was in the air at that time was an interest in intersectional feminism and this idea of women of color as an identity. So Saucy actually grew out of these women of color gatherings that were multidisciplinary. This was one that happened really close to here in Brooklyn, where it was only women of color invited. And Saucy, similar to Godzilla, would host monthly slide slams. And every year since their founding has produced an annual exhibition of works. So you would have artists and curators get together and share work with each other. They would show their work at places like Icon and Exit Arts, get guest curators, people like Chris Liu, Derek Adams, and Sacha Grayson. And Jayashree Abhikandani, who just curated the big exhibition of Asia Society on South Asian diasporic arts, was a central member of Saucy and involved in a lot of these slide slams and exhibitions. One other important note is that starting in the 90s, and I think continuing up today, I think you have a lot more awareness and consciousness of Asian American as containing many different diasporic identities. So I think especially Saucy, up to the present, you have an attention to South Asian versus East Asian, West Asian artists, and that's an ongoing conversation that I think really picks up in the 90s. Okay, so kind of to the present day, I think one really interesting example of a contemporary Asian American art collective is the Chinatown Art Brigade, co-founded by Tamiya Arai, Betty Yu, and Nancy Kong. And Tamiya Arai, as you might know, was part of many of these collectives from Godzilla through Basement Workshop. And what the Chinatown Art Brigade is uniquely interested in is gentrification in Chinatown. But not only that, using arts as a lens into that issue as a way to explore these broader global economic, social issues. So they use different art-making tactics to do these public interventions. I think all three artists would really identify as public artists. So they would do these projections at night in Chinatown where they had anti-gentrification messages. They had the public write their own messages on these cards and have them projected. They collaborated with CAV, Organizing Asian Communities, to stage some of these teach-ins on tenants' rights. And really, with this political mission, I think the term brigade is a kind of a throwback to the 1970s of having art serve a critical social purpose. Okay, now we're going to talk about the kids. Is anyone part of the Yellowjackets here? Okay, so the Yellowjackets Collective, which is connected, I think, to VUFU, Bias Forest, they started around 2015. And the Yellowjackets mission is to be a queer, intersectional, yellow American collective collaborating towards radical futures that centralize marginalized bodies. So I think what's interesting about the Yellowjackets Collective and VUFU is, again, taking a lot of the tactics of the art world, and I think a lot of the tactics of maybe the fashion and party world, and applying them towards these questions of social change. I think one of their favorite terms is scamming, right? So taking resources from arts institutions and putting them towards other areas. they started, I think, in this warehouse that was going to be converted into something else in Clinton Hill. So for a month, they took over this big space and had this kind of like frenetic series of teach-ins, art installations, video screenings, parties, meditation centers. And that was a collaboration with BUFU, which is a collaborative living archive centered around pan-Black and pan-Asian cultural and political relationships. So it was called a month of Black and Asian futurities, and it was very much an intentionally cross-racial organization. I think something else interesting about Yellowjackets is they're also very interested in oral history and the archive. So they'll talk about different figures in Asian American history who've inspired them. They will do these oral history nights where they teach people to record, for example, their family stories, and really start a conversation between the younger generation of their members and their families, their ancestors. Okay, and then there's the group Another in New York. Anyone from Another here? Okay. I can say anything I want then. So, Another is a group of artists, writers, and curators that advocate for Asians and Asian Americans in the arts. My understanding is they came out of the co-founders Eddie Kim and Eddie Chu. Sorry, that was racist. Eddie Chu and Naomi Reese, feeling this kind of alienation in the art world, where they felt like the work wasn't being very understood, wasn't being talked about in ways that they felt was intelligent. Not dissimilar to, I think, early Godzilla questions. And I think what's interesting about Another is they're very curious about this history we're talking about right now. So they organized that reunion I mentioned of Godzilla a couple months ago. We had about 12, 15 members all get together in the biggest panel discussion I've ever moderated. It was a lot of fun. But then they also are taking on questions of institutional racism. So, the big spring break art show last year, earlier this spring, there was this art collective that did an installation that we don't have to talk about. It was racist. And Another kind of got together and really highlighted that. So they got a lot of press calling out what they thought was a really inappropriate use of Asian culture and images. And then this is a very preliminary sketch, so don't quote me on this, but I did a really quick, some really quick theorizing about what these different arts collectives were informed by in the air through these different histories. And I'm definitely open to different perspectives. This is by no means a comprehensive list. But I think there's some really interesting parallels and through lines between these lineages. So for example, one of their first projects Godzilla did was at the new museum where they traced their own history back to Basement Workshop, right? And then of course Another did a Godzilla reunion. I think there's a similarity in the kind of frenetic installation quality between BUFU and Epoxy. Slide slams, just this very basic idea of presenting your work to people who understand you, to people from the same community. That's something that you see in Godzilla, Saucy, and Another. I would say Basement Workshop and Yellowjackets actually have in common that they're not interested in making objects for galleries and museums, but rather interested. Basement did have its own gallery, but they're more interested, I think, in the politics of art and art making. So these are just some things to get our brains thinking and our conversation going. And I think with that, we'll move into our panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so maybe Margo and Bing, you could come up here and join me. What strikes me about both of your biographies is one of the first things you did when you moved to New York City was join one of these organizations. And Margo, it was Basement Workshop, is that right?
Basement was the first, it wasn't the first political group I ever belonged to.
Okay, yeah, and then Bing, of course, sharing a loft. And so why join these collectives? What were you looking for? What drew you to that process of politicization?
Well, I mean, just to say, I mean, I came to New York. I came to New York in 1968. Many of you were not born then. But what it meant was that I actually came on the very crux of, huge anti-war movement was, very, very active. I was at NYU. I came directly from Hawaii, so it was a little bit of culture shock. But was also very active at the time. There was the Young Lords. There was some of the early feminist groups are there. Also Peace and Freedom Party, which some of you may remember. SDS. So in other words, it was like a whole nexus of different types of activism. But what I didn't actually come in contact with until later was ACE and the Asian American movement, because that was actually a bit later. But I would say that sort of the early third world politics and intersectionalism, those kinds of ideas, like forming alliances, was actually something that sort of set the stage for me. So in other words, I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's a kind of a trajectory of getting involved with this. So I'll stop there.
Well, when I first got to move to New York, as I mentioned before, Godzilla, from the Godzilla, and we worked on different disciplines, on sculpture, painter, and all that. And I worked in the studio too at that time, and also when I first come to New York, I'm a street artist too. I put up posters in the street, and I use stencil as well. And that's before epoxy. And that's how I met Aaron Doherty, the Red Spot Outdoor Slide Theater. And because we both work in the street, and we both posted, the poster on the wall. And he's the same thing, and he used 4 pieces of Xerox and put it up into a big one. But he's not doing, at home. He's just doing the street. I'm doing that too. So that's at that time, I think that for gaining some exposure for Asian American artists come to New York. At that time, I haven't met any people yet. So that's urged me to go out and did it. That's it. That's early. That's in 1979, late 70s, and early 80s. I did it for maybe 2-3 years. And then we talk about that in the law with Ming and Jerry, and because we do differently, and maybe we should do something and totally different. And at that time, maybe just use Artist Collective's name to kind of promote it and see what happened. And that's how it started. And until Cork joined in, and he had a storefront, and he found that Cork Gallery and said, hey, let's show it there. And at that time, Mott Street is the street full of galleries, and that is before East Village. That Mott Street Gallery is called Mott Street Gallery Association at that time. And there's Stolven galleries there, and a lot of other galleries there. And so Cork is one of those pioneered, at that time.
Yeah.
And that's how we start.
So that raises another great question. So there's this classic debate, right, in the art world. Do you work within institutions? Do you make your own institution, or do you make your own collective? And I think these different arts collectives had really interesting responses to those strategic questions. So Basin Workshop was its own group. Godzilla challenged institutions, but also roved around to different arts institutions in New York City. Quack Gallery was its own place. Tell me about how you thought of these different tactics.
Well, the epoxy with the Cork Gallery, okay, and both epoxy and Cork Gallery, and we work on the projects. We never think about about selling the work. and we never think about, say, put our name in an institution and hustle for a show. And we just were passive until we gained some exposure, and Alternative Museum approached us, and New Museum approached us, and of course we said, yeah, we didn't say no at that time. But to start with, our goal is not that. Our goal is not for aiming for the institution and have a show there. The goal is not selling because it's unsellable, and those works, works on the wall. After that, we just demolish it. That's what we're doing.
Margo, do you want to add anything on
Well,
that?
actually, I was going to ask, so therefore, what was the main goals? You're saying a lot of things that it kind of wasn't, but then what was it?
The main goal is very simple in the beginning. We try to do something different from what we have been doing in our own studio. And I did it, and I went out and do street art. And so the other members, maybe we can do something totally different. So I did my diary, and I post up in the street. And so maybe we talk about that. Maybe we can do two different things. One is we collectively and do something different. And so even though it's a kind of challenge, and another thing is we work on our own studio. We just work on our own work. But as a collective, we come up with a theme, a project that we never have that experience before. So that is that's different. That's why we join together and have that artist collective.
So that's interesting. Also, since you were, founding member of Godzilla as well, I mean, I think that when we first got together to even discuss Godzilla, the three of us had somewhat different agendas. I mean, at that point, your agenda was, what did you want to do with Godzilla?
My agenda is networking.
Okay.
Because, because of what I think, even now, the Asian American is more or less a political term. Culturally, we don't necessarily understand more, among our Asian American group.
Mm-hmm.
So that my goal is to network all other Asian American artists, young and established, blah, blah, blah. And through the networking, perhaps we can understand each other more culturally and bring that geographic angle. And that's what we think.
And I think that's certainly the goal that I also shared personally. But there was also, some of us were talking about, well, we really need the Asian American Art Museum, and that was like a lofty goal, and we still, perhaps we could still aspire, but, that was on the agenda. We talked about that. But we also talked about the need, along with this idea of networking, for there to be some kind of platform so that we can also spread the word about what different Asian American artists are doing and try to, disseminate it, to start to build up a network that was also national as well as local. And that's one of the reasons that we did the newsletter. And so that was an important platform at that time. It was also a critical platform because there aren't that many issues of it. What's really interesting, in that one, that image I showed of that issue, Nobody Knows My Name. What really came out of that was a great deal of critique, internal critique, about the very problem of, constituting this thing called Asian American art. And there were a lot of artists who were very highly against it. It's like they felt constrained. It was what I was saying in my lecture. But the point was that the platform itself wasn't just about, let's all band together, but it was also let's think critically about what we're doing. What are the downsides here? What's problematic? Because, the thing is that, as Bing's rightly pointing out, they were very aware of internal difference. And that was one of the things that really came sharply to the forefront, as I said, certainly by the 80s. And so I think the baseline, though I would agree with Bing, that I think that maybe the common goal we shared was networking and creating a base of basically kind of a dialogue that could happen face to face. The face to face is really important, because we can write to each other, we can tweet each other, we can do all this stuff, but being together like we are right now, this room is great. But that togetherness, actually being, in the same space with one another, was huge. And I think maybe that might be what, I speculate that when you look at the younger groups now, that's still a reason.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. And actually, you mentioned this before, but Godzilla grew out of the Tuesday lunch group. Is that right? So there's people like eating together, right? Yeah.
The Tuesday lunch club is, every Tuesday. At that time, we're not that busy. We can have lunch from noon time to 5 o'clock, and then coffee. And that is we talk about networking because the Tuesday lunch club is Korean, American, Chinese American, American born Chinese, and Japanese, and all that. But I think about the cultural difference is about fear. Because we don't want to understand, and then we don't want something strange, we don't want something unknown. I think food is something that is so strange. You go to any country, you eat the local food, but it's inside your body, not fear. And that is so strange. And I think that is a good networking tool. Is that's why the Church Lunch Club is still exists, believe it or not. But again, it's only 2 diehard members.
I was also going to add though that we didn't necessarily think Godzilla was going to last. It wasn't like meant to be a permanent institution. We wanted it, so some of us wanted like this. But not necessarily. Would you disagree? Maybe you do.
For Godzilla, I think every artist collective during that period of time it served the purpose, and time move on. The whole society different, and so they should have the new artist collectives come out. And whatever Godzilla doing, we did it. And maybe the younger generation, they have a different idea of artist collective, and which is a sign that I can see from here to Godzilla. There's a whole bunch of
There's also Godzuki in here too.
yeah, Godzilla too, and Tomato Grey too.
That's logical. We did talk about that, and also when the leadership turned over at a certain point, and part of that was intentional because, there's a real awareness that like other people need to take it, and do what they need to do with this umbrella. So it wasn't, the goal was not to create like yet another, organization of a regular kind. So I think in that sense, we saw the Godzuki emerge, it was fresh. It was a different generation. And then I think that for those of you folks who've read Alexandra Chang's book, Envisioning Diaspora, she talks about several formations, and how the younger generations really had a kind of a different viewpoint in some ways. And, so it really was, I think, a difference, from maybe some of the other models that preceded us.
Absolutely. So at this point,
maybe there's other questions.
Yeah, I would love to hear from the audience. Yeah.
I'm looking at the timeline, and I'm thinking that now that we have a full sort of 2 generations, and I'm thinking of things that my parents were doing at the time that Basic Workshop was around, and then to where my generation and maybe my older sister's generation, somewhere in the middle, kind of picked up at different points, and First, I noticed that between 2001 and 2015, there seems to be sort of a dearth of activity, and I'm just wondering if there's been any explanations as to why, whether there was an actual lull, or if there has been a recent sort of, since 2015, and just of reticence, like what might account for that moment. And also just when we think back at, from 1969 up until now, I mean, I guess that makes it almost coming up close to half a century here. So how do artists from the original time period think about archiving their work when a common refrain you hear is that we didn't think this was last. It was just right here and now we were doing it. And so now that we think about how to historicize this and preserve it for posterity, how do we look back on that? And perhaps you as a curator have something to say.
Yeah, great question. Let's take Bob's question and then we'll answer both.
Hi, I'm Bob Lee. I'm with the Asian American Art Center. We are a for-profit. We're not a collective. However, I would like to take this moment to remember Rumiko Tsuda, who had her gallery on Mott Street, who did a nude tea ceremony at that time, and we gathered at her place too. I also want to take note that Facing Workshop was also a for-profit organization. It wasn't an umbrella, but it was a for-profit. My wife was the person who filled out the forms to make it a for-profit. So I just want to say that there's a crossover line there.
And not for profit.
We are a non-profit, not a non-profit. Non-profit. Maybe I'm wishing now in my old age that I was a for-profit. And the fax machine that Bing is talking about was actually given to us by a local store because we couldn't afford to buy one. And it's only because they gave us that machine, that we were able to collect all the images that we did to be a part of the Tenement Square exhibition. But I do have a question, and that is the last remark that Margo you made about about the issue of power. The curator, yes, and so that was, for me, is very important to see how all of our activism, whether we're for-profits or collectives, all of our activism in reaching out is connected to what is the problem with this culture, with the society we're part of, and how power is manipulated. And I think that's part of stepping outside of how our culture, our society, our economy works, and trying to speak to a different human being who wants to emerge. But the quote you mentioned, could you elucidate that quote?
No, I think that what Karen Hito was trying to point out was that, when you really talk about how to potentiate like social change, that simply making art on its own is not sufficient. That there is also a lot of lateral, other activity that has to go on. So when she's talking about the entire ecology of the art world, we're not even the art world. We're talking about the ecology, the curating, the writing, the other kinds of activism and different platforms. The way as with Godzilla and a lot of other groups, that if you that simply one channel is insufficient. And I think that was really the main point. That we need to look at the entire system and all the ways in which we are represented. We need to represent ourselves. All the ways that our histories have to be articulated, that it's all part of it. So the scholarship end is another piece of this. So this is, I think, what Hito is really getting at. I think what you're trying to also, in a way, parse out here. The other thing I would say about this is that, in fact, a lot of these groups share a lot of these same agendas, and so it's a little bit hard to separate out. Because you can very well imagine, even like Godzilla, it's the projects that are about gentrification, also a very strong educational component. depending on who it was who's running different projects.
Yeah.
So, but aside from that, yeah, I think it's brilliant. I mean,
I'll take that. Michelle, to your question. So as was pointed out, for time's sake, I left out Godzuki, which was an offshoot of Godzilla. That was the tiny monster. That was around from 2001 to about 2005, 2006. And I can't speak to the gap, but I do think that this recent resurgence is really about this generation that grew up disillusioned with the Obama years and was galvanized by Occupy and Black Lives Matter. And also because of the rise of social media, is able to speak directly to institutions in that world and very quickly transmit these theories and messages. So I think that is my theory about the kind of resurgence in Asian American arts collectives recently. But I'm definitely open to other interpretations.
And I also, too, wanted to add just one thing maybe to the bottom of this. I mean, is that what's also interesting now is to see some of the folks who are trying to work within some big institutions. And what I'm thinking about is Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. A lot of you folks probably went to was it Control Alt, the culture lab that was here in New York. But they've now done 3 of these in 2 years, which is like kind of remarkable. So 2016 they did 2 in DC, in New York, and then I just saw the one that was in Honolulu. But the point is that this group, I mean, it's like they're working within a huge institution, but their ideas, I mean, they recently published a Cultural Lab Manifesto, in which, it's very much, I mean, the kinds of agendas that we're talking about, where they're really committed to trying to push forward social change and to reinitiate contact, like person-to-person contact, to create spaces of dialogue. And the 3 curators who were working the Hawaii one were Lawrence Vin Davis, Kaleva Correa, and I just, that's bad, Adriel Luis. And alongside it, they have a small staff, but the profile is huge. What they're trying to do online, I mean, people should check out their website. But what's interesting is that, again, these people are highly progressive, and they try to work that agenda from way inside. And so I would say that there's also a place maybe for something like this to happen. And it's also worth looking at. Just take a look at their site. But so they felt very strongly too that they wanted to reach out to Hawaii to get outside the continental U.S. model. Because it's always been a problem for ethnic studies, Asian American studies, being kind of confined to the U.S. Which is, I think, one of the questions that was raised before. So they wanted to see what our relationships were, what the cross-currents were in the Pacific, and beyond. What is our relationship with, Pacific Islanders? And part of their real agenda was to bring together various indigenous peoples and Asians and, other groups, and using Hawaii as a kind of platform. So, I mean, I think that the resources, I mean, again, because they are the Smithsonian, a part of it, some of this is made possible by that. So, I'm actually quite impressed, I'm kind of amazed by it. But I'm just saying that as we think about the constellation of, what is possible now and what people are trying to do, I would just add that. I don't know if any of you would. I guess some of you were there. They control Alt. And I don't know. I mean, I'm curious to hear what your experience of it was. Do we have time, Jane?
Yep. We have till 5.
Yeah.
6.
All right, folks. See you guys.
Or any last questions, comments? Anyone from the outside?
You want me to call on you?
Margo, how about if your information and Dave's and Ryan's extends further into like art departments at universities? I think that's really a key way to not just network with the information and the thought processes that went on for decades, but to kind of redirect how we make art. Whether it be your transnational be put into, and kind of like the rawness that, you know, I saw through all these curators and the new kind of, a lot of curatorial work and social.
For further reading, Godzilla's archives and Epoxy's archives are at the New York Fields Library. So check those out. We have one more question here.
Epoxy
You got? Okay. Margo, did you want to speak?
Oh, no, I just wanted to say that actually I think that one of the key things is actually some of the academic research institutes. You know, the one, like, I was thinking about NYU, the Asian Pacific American Institute. It's done an enormous amount of programming, but also they were key in getting some of those archives into fails because they're working with the library of Martin Taylor on this. But I feel like they're actually the bastions, the anchors that will enable us to get some of that material at least available. You know, because right now it's sitting in a lot of people's houses. We know this. I myself have a big archive too. And some people look at me hopefully, you know, don't you want to donate this? Not that yet. No, anyway, so. But I do think that because, you know, frankly, I've taught for many years, and I think that it's really extraordinarily difficult to try to push like an Asian American art history agenda. You know, that generally what graduate students are told are things like this. That if you're going to do Asian American art history, first you should be doing American art history, and then you can subspecialize, because otherwise no one's going to hire you. And you know, this is academia, but I'm just saying that very little has changed in that regard, except that there are some progressive programs. I will say, if anybody's looking for doctoral studies, UC Santa Cruz recently started a visual studies program. That's very strong on this, and you know, there are people working there. But I'm just saying that if I could only name one, that says a lot. Like, this is like 40, 50 years on, as people pointing out here. So I say the research institutes are really important. And yeah, and I'm going to stop there and say I really think that that's the way to go.
It's not okay.
I can add a little bit about iPhone, just a little bit, because we've been talking about the legacy of artists recently, in the United States and other countries too. And right now we have all the information on the internet, and a lot of the information, I'm not talking about fake news, it's too many. And they're talking about two different things. And how to understand that is the correct one and complete one, because it's all fragmented all over the places. And maybe I add a little bit to the slide I did not talk about. It's one of the show. It's called Dragon and Pearl and Eagle and Apple. And a lot of I find out a lot of media, they wrote the title of the show is Dragon and Pear, Eagle and Apple. Perhaps it's for IQ test. It's correct, but it doesn't make sense because dragon is signifies icon of China, and pearl is Oriental. Pearl is the symbol of Hong Kong, and eagle is represent America, and apple, the big one, is New York. So that makes sense, but they think it's a typo. They think it's like a dragon, an eagle, and pear, and apple. So I found so many places have that typo there, and who had the energy to collect that? And imagine like a couple of decades later for researcher, and which one is the right? Maybe dragon and pear and eagle and apple makes sense to them. You know what I mean? So that is the problem. That about what are we going to do about a typo?
We've now got you on tape, so we know what the answer is. We have one more question here.
It wasn't a question, it was just a comment about the way that this chart is organized. And it was based off of the comment about the similarities between some of the groups that are on here. And I wonder that if you added another column to the right, in addition to political concerns, that you added tactics or strategies or ways of art making, that then could be a different way to organize this chart and how the different groups relate to each other. And then to tie it back to your original question about collectivism, that might get you to another way of thinking about the importance of collectivism and its relationship to identity that isn't necessarily chronological, teleological, or generational, but shows how these kind of groups and ways of thinking and art making are imbricated. That might lead to a more productive thinking about the relation between identity politics and collective art making.
Well, that's very good. Well, you know, on that
I just want
Barbara,
to make one point about archives. They are so important, and to keep them intact. I worked at the Getty last year for 3 months. I'm now working at the New York Public Library, using little bits of their information, and I think actually they're starting to warm up again to deeper archives, like fails, because archives take money to catalog. And fails sometimes won't take one unless there's money to catalog it. So these are all things to think about. And they're just so important. Primary reference information, what Bing is talking about, the errors that go on and get perpetuated, it's so important.
Well, on that, thank you very much. Infomercial without mentioning Age Art Archive.
Well, it is
I'm joking. No, it's really, I mean, it is really important. We have Fox, parking archive at Age Art Archive. Yeah. But it's, to me, what is coming out of this, I mean, no one can archive anything. Certainly there's this huge constraints on time, effort, money, all the rest of it, access, a million things that really is important to promote and really fun to promote the collection and the cataloging, archiving of materials like this. So whether it's the fails, whether it's the Getty, but your own universities, your own museums. I mean, the idea is to bring these networks, again, these collaborative efforts into networking relationships so that we can share and then build, creatively, not only factually check the past, but it actually really importantly, create new ideas and new knowledge around that. So I totally agree with you, but all of you can do some of this, and I really hope that you will. Anyway, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Bing. Thank you, Margo. It's been extremely interesting, and I hope this is just the beginning of a whole series of conversations around this topic. So thank you all for coming.